Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and especially for braving the weather. We're getting a break right now. That's awesome, but I know I was hoping people would show up with all this rain. So thank you for making the effort. We've got a really good show today. A lot of great information, and of course, Dr. Mirafarka is here with us today. So we're going to make this kind of a working lunch. So keep eating, and we'll just keep talking. They have a clicker. So it's kind of crazy to think about, but this time last year when we did our event, the market was in the doldrums, and here we are now today at record highs. So how quickly things change. I'm sure Mira's got a lot to say about the Fed, but they just don't seem to be able to quench this appetite for a strong economy and a strong stock market. So we are still rolling along. Like I say, we're at market highs. We have solid GDP growth. Consumer spending was strong during December's Christmas rush. New home sales, although they're down, they're improving. Initial job claims remain low. We're going to get some more profit results today from a couple of the big tech companies, and then Friday we get a jobs report. So everything seems to be just rolling along, so it's going to be interesting to see what the Fed does going forward. I think Mira will have some ideas. The markets were certainly disappointed yesterday when they said they were going to keep rates exactly where they're at. So there was a bit of a tantrum over that, but they have been saying that for months now, so it was no surprise really. Headwinds, we do have a presidential election we're all looking forward to this year. And I get numerous calls, should we get out of the market? What's going to happen, if so-and-so gets elected or so-and-so doesn't get elected. So I have an opportunity today, a little surprise for you all. I know some of you recognize this face, Tyler Furyk with the Capital Group. He's spoken at our events in the past. The Capital Group has been doing a long-term study on market results during presidential election cycles, and they update that every time we have a presidential election cycle. So he's going to share some of that information with you today. We included the full brochure, the full report in your packets, so you have that to refer to later. So without any further ado, would you help me welcome Mr. Tyler Furyk?
That's so great. Thanks, Jim. Can everyone hear me okay if I speak like this just for a minute? Yes. Does that sound good? Okay. Well, thank you for having me. As Jim mentioned, I'm Tyler Furyk with Capital Group, or American Funds. Our headquarters is based here in Los Angeles, and I get to work with RIAs or advisors like Jim, like Terry, all over Southern California. So think of me as kind of a liaison between capital markets and the stock market and fixed income markets, and then Terry and Jim and Amy. So thanks for having me today. I'm actually probably more interested in hearing about maybe your next speaker in a couple minutes or so, because I'm not going to tell you who's going to win the election in a couple months. But there is a presentation inside that packet that you have in front of you. You don't need to turn there. I know you're enjoying your meals. But on page 4 of that presentation shows you what happens in an election year that we're in today, or this year, versus a non-election year. And all I'll say is, if you had any volatility in your portfolios over the last couple of years, I would say historically, your election year tends to be your most volatile years out of the 4 presidential years. So all that means is, right now we're seeing some positivity, we're seeing some growth. I think a lot of folks about a year ago were worried about recession, and now it seems like they're talking about soft landing and maybe just skirting through a recession. So there's reason for optimism, but at the same time you compare that volatility. And what that chart goes to show is for the first 5 or 6 months of an election year, it just tends to be a lot of up and down and a lot of head fakes. And then if this election is anything like the election a couple of years ago, again, just expect a lot of volatility in your portfolios. The good news is, historically, again, looking at that chart, after about 5 or 6 months, maybe the market has a good indicator of who's going to be in place, what policy is going to be in place as well, and how that impacts the global economy. And so you can see you're rewarded if you're a long-term investor. But I just say this, that this year is probably not going to be unlike any other election years as well. Take what you get, but also really understand your risk profile as well. So I'll be around if you have any questions as well, but thanks for having me here, folks.
Thank you, Tyler.
Just so you know, Tyler kind of agreed to do this somewhat at the last minute, so I really appreciate it. And he drove here from LA, and he's got another event I think he's hosting in downtown LA tonight or this afternoon. So I told him I'd get you in and out and get you back on the road. So thanks again, Tyler. Okay, so what happened last year and what's happening this year, we also, for those of you who have TD Ameritrade accounts or had TD Ameritrade accounts, we survived the transition to Schwab. It went pretty smoothly. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. Some of you who are in the room did have some difficulties, and I can't really explain why. What we've learned after the fact was that they took the support people that we usually talk to at TD Ameritrade and brought them over to Schwab. So when the day after Labor Day, after the conversion was done, was the first time that we could actually use their interface. So we had a huge learning curve. And then when we called to get support, they were in the same position we were. They didn't really know how to use the system. So it's been difficult. It's getting better. We are still having some trouble with trying to link checking accounts to Schwab accounts. That's been a bit of a snafu. And for those of you who are taking qualified distributions from your IRAs, that's taking charitable distributions, that has been a bit of a nightmare. They do not have the system in place, and I was really shocked. Such a well-established company didn't have a backup for that. So we're hoping that they get that resolved. Angel figured out a way to kind of navigate through that temporarily. It's not an ideal situation, so we'll keep you posted. We still have a long-standing relationship with SEI Private Trust Company. They're circling. They want more of our business, and we're negotiating right now to get them to lower their account minimums and some of their fees. So that could be in the works. So if you had enough of Schwab, let us know, and we can make the transition. We also entered into an agreement with a brand new company called Altruist. They're more of a tech-savvy custodial service. If you're familiar with Robinhood, I would say it's fair to say they're like a Robinhood for investment advisory firms. So we're giving that a test run currently. We had a couple clients that said they were willing to give it a shot, so we'll see how that goes. It should be, I'm thinking ahead with the next generation who like to do everything on their phones, because it's a strictly online type of format. Speaking of younger people, we are pleased to announce that we brought on Angel Mendez back in June. And it turned out to be a critical timing, especially through the transition with Schwab, because we really needed all three of us to navigate that transition. So we're very grateful that he was willing to come on board at the right time. I'd like to bring him up right now, let him tell you all a little bit about himself and some of the things we got cooking up for 2024.
It's really great to be here with you all today for our annual luncheon. For those who don't know me, my name is Angel Mendez. I am the newest member of the RAI Wealth Management team. Just a little bit of background on myself. I'm a recent graduate from the California State University of Fullerton, just down the road from here.
Go Tigers!
Yeah, go Tigers! Yeah, so with that background in financial planning, it actually allowed me to then take the Uniform Investment Advisor Law examination a couple months afterwards, which was a great thing. And now I have my eyes set on the CFP, or Certified Financial Planner examination, which I sit in for next month. So please wish me luck on that. I also wanted to share some exciting news about the innovative enhancements that we've been undertaking the past couple of months. We've been rolling out some exciting things. That first one, as Jim mentioned, was Altruist. Now, Altruist is a cutting-edge custodian that caters a bit to the folks that like a bit more technology woven into the advisory experience. They call themselves the modern age custodian in comparison to other legacy custodians such as Charles Schwab because of their easy and fast interface. So, next on the list we have Pontera. Now, Pontera is a platform we utilize to actually manage your held away accounts. And these accounts include your profit sharing 401ks, your 403bs, tax sheltered annuities, and the list goes on. But all these accounts were previously unavailable for advisors to manage prior to this. So we really are thankful to Pontera for changing the way advisors work and manage so we can help all of you. Additionally, I wanted to bring up our newest financial planning system, eMoney. Now, eMoney is a dynamic tool that we use and to aggregate all the most important aspects of your lives and build a comprehensive financial plan catering to your financial needs and ultimately having a map to meet your goals. So we're really excited about that. If you would, if you think that you can benefit from a financial plan or anyone you know, we would love to help out there. Lastly, I just want to remind everyone that we have adopted a new client portal called AdviseOn. If you were on the Orion platform, we have sunsetted that recently, and but we've been getting a lot of great feedback from AdviseOn that it's really quick and easy interface. So you can access all of your account information, your statements, documents, etc. So please, if you haven't done so already, reach out whenever you guys have some time, and we can get you on the application and the platform very seamlessly. Well, that's all I have today. Really interested in the questions you might have. If anything I said has piqued your interest, please reach out whenever you guys have a chance. I would love to go into more details about that. So, thank you all.
Thank you, Angel.
I'd just like to add to what Angel was saying about AdviseOn and client portals. I know it gets really confusing because every custodian has their own portal. But for those of you who have maybe accounts at both SEI and Schwab, if you use our portal, it's all there together. So you don't have to be bouncing back and forth between two custodial portals. So that's ideal. And then eMoney, again, if you have held away assets, we're doing a financial plan. It's a one-stop place to see all of your net worth and financials. So they say there's only two things certain in life, and it's death and taxes. So in relation to the latter, I'm so fortunate to have a partner who is a tax expert. All of you know Terry Grassi, and I always ask her, you know, what's coming up for the next year that our clients need to be aware of. So I've asked her to put together a little presentation today so you can be aware of what the tax situation is going to be like in 2024. So please give it up for Terry Grassi. You want to use that one? Sure.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, one thing I want to remind everybody, if you did the transition with us from TD Ameritrade to Schwab, you're going to be receiving two 1099s. One from Schwab, one from TD Ameritrade. So before you go do your taxes, if it's just an investment account, you need both of them. If you've been taking distributions from your retirement account, just make sure you have both of them, okay? If you have any questions, contact us. Very important. Okay, so in 2023, there was really no tax legislation yet. There is something in Congress that they're trying to work out. There's a couple of things that might affect 2023, but it's mainly for businesses. And the individual item that might be affected is child care tax credit. So it's nothing real big, so there's really not a lot of tax update this year. But just a couple of numbers I wanted to bring to your attention. There is a slight increase in the allowable contributions to your retirement plans. So be it a, IRA, simple IRA, 401k, they all have a little bit of increases. So for instance, the IRAs were $6,500 contribution. In 2023, they're now $7,000 plus your $1,000 if you're over 50. So if you're contributing and you want to max it out, you might want to change your contributions. Everybody always asks about how much can I give away this year to somebody? So in 2024, that number is $18,000. If you give away $18,000 or less, you don't have to file any forms. You just give the money to whoever you'd like. And it's $18,000 per person that you can give away. So it's a lot of money. The estate tax exemption is now $13.6 million per person. That means you can give away or you can leave to your heirs $13.6 million without being subject to any estate or gift tax. Anything over that is 40% estate tax. So, and I bring this up when I mention something later, so remember that. Okay. Next slide. Last year we talked about the required minimum distribution going up to age 73. It's still 73. If you turn 73 in 2024, you're going to have to take a distribution from your IRAs or retirement plans. Just a reminder, when we met last year, I talked about how to take Social Security taxability and Medicare premiums. Those are actually determined by your total income. So planning is very important. We also talked about a qualified charitable contribution, which is HQCD, and that is an IRA distribution direct to charity. You can do this when you're 70 and a half years old. You can contribute $100,000 annually to charities, and this can help lower your tax bracket if you have required distributions that you're taking. So it brings your taxes down, your taxable income down. It could bring your Social Security taxability down. It could bring your Medicare down. You really need to work with your tax person because, again, planning is very important on this. The other thing that's important, if you are doing this, there is nothing on the 1099 you receive saying what your distributions were from your retirement account that will tell your tax person that you did this. You have to be the one to tell them, or they won't know. Next one. So future planning. So in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, and that reduced taxes a lot. But it had an automatic sunset provision that will revert many of the changes they made in 2017. And this will happen in 2026. So it's not that far away. What does it mean to us? Well, if Congress doesn't act and do something, and those revisions take place, the estimated estate and gift tax exemption is going to be $6.8 million per person. That's what you can give away or your heirs can inherit. That's half of the current amount. So if you're getting close to that number, you might want to do something in the next couple of years to get some planning done. The standard deductions are going to decrease to half of what they are now. So if you haven't been able to itemize, you may be itemizing in 2026. The tax rates are going to go up. The tax brackets are going to narrow. And alternative minimum tax is going to affect a lot more people now. The state and local tax deduction, or SALT deduction, that you've been hearing about, the $10,000 limit on taxes, that will go away. And exemption deduction will come back in. So the net effect of this is most people's taxes will go up. So without Congress doing anything in 2026, tax rates are going up. So we hope that they will do something, but again, we're in an election year. We don't know what will happen. We don't know who will be elected, and we don't know what they're going to do. So just listen and be aware, and maybe start planning for the future in case this all comes into place. you may be able to do some things to try to keep your taxes down if they don't do anything. Okay, that's about it. Everything else is about the same.
All right, everyone. Now, this is what you've been looking for. Those of you who have experienced the Mayor Farka presentation. If you haven't, you're in for a great treat. I can't thank Mira enough. She has been so gracious with her time and willingness to do these events year after year. I've lost track of how many you've done for us, so I really appreciate it. She has an extensive resume, which we put in your packet, so please take the time to look at that. So without any further ado, introduce Dr. Mira Farka. You know the clicker.
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. This is always my favorite. Are we on? Are we good? You guys, I'm loud anyway, so you can always hear me. You're not going to miss it. It's always my favorite event of the year. I usually start the year with Jim's event, which is fantastic because it always, somehow it's been good luck for me personally. Hopefully for your portfolios as well. Last couple of years have been fun. Now, I'm sure we met last year and I gave you some prediction, and I'm sure you're kind of wondering, probably with what's been going on in the economy, you're kind of wondering what is going on with that promised recession. Remember, you were promised this recession. This is a Wall Street survey of the economists. 63%, over 60% told you, it was like quarter after quarter after quarter, all of them were expecting a recession to happen in 2023, right? I mean, but there was no recession, certainly. We all promised you one, there was no recession, which reminded me of something that Churchill once said, which is, oh, sorry, this is not showing. It should have shown there. There was a quote by Churchill that says, "Nothing in life is so exhilarating than being shot at with no result." He actually did survive a couple of assassination attempts. It's supposed to be there, that quote, for some reason not showing up. But, the economy has been shot at many times, but it survived. It's been doing pretty well, right? If anything, of course, the worries about falling into a recession have to do with the Fed raising interest rates, right? So here, for example, you have Fed funds rate going up. So we started in March of 22, almost 2 years ago, right? Went up to 5.25%. Fast and furious. Here is, if you look back over the last 4 decades, this is the rate hiking cycles. For example, the last one in 2015, it was sort of slow and gentle. That took 3 years. The terminal rate was only 2.25. And here is every other hiking cycle since 1980s, right? Over the last 4 decades. So this one has been the most aggressive, the fastest, the furious, right? Because we actually had to deal with quite a bit of inflation. But throughout this whole thing, all we've seen is, what have we seen? Real GDP, the economy has been holding up pretty well, pretty resilient, pretty strong. Real GDP has gone up by 3.6%. Employment up 6.2 million since the beginning of the Fed starting increasing interest rates. Unemployment rate only up a smidgen, 0.1%, nothing, right? So the economy has been kind of very strong. If anything, as Jim mentioned, the economy is picking up. If you look at real GDP growth rate last year, first half of the year was 2.1%, which is the usual expansion. Second half growth was, the average of the second half was 4.2%, twice the pace of the first half. So it's picking up speed, if anything. And the question is, what's going on? And in a sense, so what happened? Why do we have no recession, right? And full disclosure here, and I was here last year, and I, along with a lot of economists, expected that maybe by the end of last year, early this year, we'll probably face some kind of recession. So we have kind of a lot of explaining to do in a way. So that's why first, I know you're here to see me squirm, but let me give you the reasons why sort of the calls for a recession have been a little off. And in a sense, there are like kind of 4 reasons for it. 2 of them were kind of completely unexpected, in a sense, almost hard to predict. And I'll lay it out in front of you here. The other 2, we were kind of given a little bit of misleading, erroneous information. So I'll walk you through all those 4 reasons as we walk here today, and then we'll look forward to the outlook. First of all, the very first reason why recession calls were so far off, I have to say it's got to be Taylor Swift. I mean, the woman single-handedly prevented a recession. The Fed should build her a shrine and pray to her every day. She added $5 billion, an estimated $5 billion in real GDP last year. In fact, if you look at the concerts by Taylor Swift, you got Beyonce, and you got the Barbenheimer movie, right? All of them combined for about 10 billion of real GDP. We couldn't have predicted Taylor Swift. So you can't blame economists for the phenomenon. The woman is everywhere. I don't know. She's ubiquitous now. Wherever you turn, she's everywhere, right? And you're going to see quite a bit of Taylor Swift today. It'll follow you everywhere. Now, the second reason why recession calls were off has to do with AI. Of course, last year was huge for AI, ChatGPT and so on. And in fact, and that's the main reason why the stock market has taken off, right? I mean, and the problem with AI is that this kind of technology booms, this kind of productivity booms are kind of hard to predict in advance. They're very, very difficult to foresee. So that obviously we missed that. Now, if you look at the stock market here, it's up, from January of 23 up almost 30%. But if you look at the tech sector alone, that's up almost 70%. Right? In fact, if you look at the Magnificent Seven, these are your Nvidias, your Amazon, your Teslas, and so on. 66% of the growth in the stock market last year was due to just these top 7 stocks, right? And in fact, if you look at S&P 500 equally weighted, this is basically a different measure of S&P, which strips away the importance of the tech sector. It's up about 11%. I mean, decent, pretty good, but not as crazy as what you see for, when it comes to the tech sector, and especially when it comes to S&P 500. So AI was the second reason why recession calls were off. And again, kind of hard to predict this kind of productivity booms. Now, the third reason, of course, is that we've spent a bunch of money at the federal level, oodles of government cash everywhere, not just during the pandemic, but since the pandemic. So if you look at the government expenditures, so we spent about $6 trillion during COVID. Remember, we had the CARES Act way in March of 2020 when the pandemic happened, and we had a bunch of other rounds of it since then. So total of $6 trillion. We flooded the zone, right? But then we've also spent a bunch of money since then. We've had 3 bills that were passed over the last year and a half. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, that's about $1 trillion. We've had the Inflation Reduction, which is probably going to cost between 1.2 and probably even more than $1.4 trillion. Again, the bills are still coming due on that. And the CHIPS Act, which is another $280 billion. So that's a combined $2.5 trillion. Of course, fiscal deficit, it's the highest at 6.4% of GDP, the highest we've ever seen outside of recessions and wars. Right? There was no reason to have all this kind of money pumped into the economy when the economy was pretty resilient. And here's another thing when I mentioned that we were given kind of misleading data or erroneous data. Back then, when we had this talk here last year, it was January of last year, but in February of last year, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, said the projections of budget deficit is 1.4 trillion for last year. It ended up being $2 trillion. That 600 billion, that made a difference between a recession and continued growth, right? So certainly that's the third reason why you kind of avoid, you can always, I guess you can avoid a recession forever if you print money and spend, right? So that kind of stands to reason. But again, we didn't know this in advance. It turned out to be that we had an extra $600 billion. So we've got Taylor Swift, AI, fiscal largesse that continues. And the fourth reason why recession calls were sort of off last year had to do with something as mundane as simple data revisions. Specifically, revisions on excess savings. So excess savings are the pot of money that people kind of saved during the pandemic because we were locked down, right? But also because of all the oodles of government cash that were kind of coming into us. Now, that money has been spent down over time, but we still have some going on. A lot of this money, this excess saving has been revised, and I'll show you in a minute. And the reason is that the government has had since the pandemic, has had a hard time kind of keeping track of the data, and the revision has been larger than usual. So for example, if you look at excess savings, originally, the Commerce Department told us excess savings were at almost $2 trillion early on. Of course, we spent it out, and by now, we would have been down to about $340 billion. Still a bit of cushion, but not enough, because this would have run out over the next 2 to 3 months or so. But in November of last year, they came back and they revised this. And the revised numbers basically had us saving more than before and spending less than. So right now, based on this excess savings, we have about $1 trillion in excess savings. Good enough to carry us for a little while longer. So that's sort of like the fourth reason why this, I mean, of course, that difference there, I mean, $700 billion that you find in the sofa cushion, that's not nothing, right? This is the reason why, I mean, you'll never fall into a recession if you have the extra money that is actually padding you, right? So these are the reasons why recession calls were actually quite off, to be honest. Now, what's the outlook? Where are we heading, right? So you heard Jim and you heard saying that, look, are we going to be able to soft land the economies? The main question is, will the Fed be able to kind of bring down the plane without crashing us, sort of tamper down inflation without shoving us into a recession? Or will we actually hit sort of a hard landing? Will we actually have a recession? And you've heard, the stories are everywhere. You've heard inflation is over and done with, right? We're done with inflation. You heard people say, well, inflation may be sticky. You heard that, oh, we are in the cusp of a boom. We got AI. Is that my hair that is making that weird noise? Sorry, I should not move that much. We got the economy being the cusp of a boom, or maybe in the cusp of a recession. You've got, maybe I should just do away with this, because there is a little bit of an echo. You've got people saying this is the beginning of a bull market. You got people say, hey, be careful because we're at the cusp of a bear market. Of course, every time Jim is involved, I say there's always a bull market. But certainly there is the outlook has never been this mixed. If you kind of look at the consensus, it's kind of landing right now towards a soft landing scenario, meaning we're going to slow down the economy, but not fall into a recession. In a sense, I feel like over pessimism of last year has turned into over optimism for this year, for 2024. What's our outlook? Well, we think that sort of the next year or two are a little bit more complex than what the conversation is turning out to be out there. In a sense, we feel that this is going to be almost like a tale of two halves. So we have the short run. In the short run, we actually think there's going to be no landing. We actually are a bit more optimistic than the consensus in the short run. The economy is pretty strong. We think growth will continue. And what I mean by the short run, basically pretty much for the balance of this year, maybe until the end of this year or so, like the next 8 to 10 months, if you will, seems to be a pretty strong sort of economy. But we are more concerned about the longer term. So what happens beyond the 10 months or beyond the 1 year period and so on. And here we're a bit more pessimistic than the consensus because we think that the economy will slow down. Probably we're going to have like a mini recession, likely. You can call it a slow session, if you will. So if it's going to be a recession, it's going to be a really mild one, which is what most people expect. So the outlook is a little bit more complex, we do think. This is what I call the Barbenheimer economy, because you got like the good and the bad, right? The positive and the negative. You got the colorful and sort of the dark, right, going on. So first of all, and this kind of slowdown that we expect in the future, at least, again, not right now, but after like a year or so, we give it a name. We call it El Duderino. I don't know if you guys know The Big Lebowski, one of my favorite movies of all time. Remember, I'm the dude, so that's what you call me. Dudeness, El Duderino. So we call it El Duderino, the diminutive, to basically distinguish it from the last two recessions. If we're going to have a recession, which is we're not sold on it, but certainly the economy is going to slow down in the future, right? Towards the end of this year, early next year, it's probably not going to be anything similar to what we saw in 2008, 2009, certainly not what we saw during the pandemic. So it's going to be a little milder, much milder than that. In fact, if you think about it, we do think that the economy has a lot in common with the dude. You know, remember he was pretty resilient, rolling with the punches. You know, you ask him, what do you do, Mr. Lebowski? Oh, I bowl, drive around, the occasional acid flashback. So we had an acid flashback to 2008 back last March. Remember when the banking sector kind of wobbled a little bit? So certainly there's a lot of similarities between the Big Lebowski, I think, and the economy. Now let's first start with the positive news, right? So, of course, the backbone of the U.S. economy have been U.S. consumers. What you see here is real consumption spending. Real consumption spending has been pretty strong. This is year-over-year percent changes. That's the historical average by 2.3%. We've had a little wobble at the end of last year, a little bit earlier in the middle of this year. But the last month and so, last couple of months, consumption spending picked up. We're up 2.7% year over year, even better than the historical average, right? And if you look, for example, at consumer sentiment, so this is the Michigan survey, that's the historical average. Now, keep in mind that this good spending happened during the time when this was really low. We were really depressed. Consumers have been more depressed last 2 years than they were even during the pandemic. So, I'm wondering, but now the good news is that the consumer sentiment has turned around, has gotten much better. So if we spend all that money while we're so depressed, I always say therapy shopping is great, right? So maybe that's what we did. So maybe that's part of it, right? But if we did that much damage when we were so depressed, imagine what we could do when we were feeling a little bit more upbeat, right? So again, consumption spending will probably continue to hold us for the next 8 to 10 months or so, right? Now, another good news is, we still have some strong fundamentals. If you look at real disposable income, which is what you see here. So notice that this is the COVID boost. So these are that $6 trillion. These are the huge increase in disposable income. This is the real disposable, not the nominal side, the real side, right? Huge increase there. Then you had a decline here in 2022. That's because inflation was leading into the real disposable income. But the good news is now this is positive. In fact, it's growing by 4.2%, 4.3%. Pretty strong numbers. The historical average is about 3.5%, but the real disposable income right now is growing at a higher rate than the historical average. And that's because the labor market has been pretty strong and the inflation has come down, right? So certainly these two are quite positive for disposable income. And if you look at household wealth, even here the numbers look fantastic. So right before the pandemic, this is financial wealth. This is wealth from the stock market, right? The last quarter, so right before the pandemic, the aggregate wealth was about almost $94 trillion. Since then, it's gone up to 115. That's a $21.4 trillion turnaround, right? Now, housing market has also done pretty well. I'll talk a little bit more about housing in just a little bit. But certainly here you have, $19 trillion right before the pandemic. We're up to $32 trillion now. That's a $13 trillion increase. Overall, if you add this up, these two sources of wealth, that's up almost $35 trillion compared to 2019. So this is the fastest increase in wealth in a 4-year period we've experienced. So again, some strong fundamentals to kind of carry us to go forward. And the good news is that even some of these troubled corners of the market, even those have kind of turned around. For example, housing market, right? So let's talk about housing market here. Here you have Orange County home prices. This is compared to February 2020, right before the pandemic. So at some point we hit like a 50% increase, like home prices went up by 50%. And then that's when the Fed hike happened, and then, home prices dropped a little bit, but they recovered quite a bit, right? So even the home prices that were a little bit of an issue, you see that decline, that's come back up again. Same story happened if you look at LA, the dip and the recovery. Same story happened when you look at Riverside County. Same story. In fact, if you look at San Bernardino, actually, home prices have set new heights now, about 54% compared to the pre-pandemic level. If you look at, so what this does actually, again, if you own a home, God bless you, this is great because you feel richer because obviously home values have picked up. On the flip side, it's virtually impossible to own a home. If you look at the affordability, it's actually worse now than it was compared to remember the housing market boom of 2005 and 2007. Right now, the numbers show that only 15% of Orange County households can afford the median home price. Back then, it was 20%, pretty low. But right now, only 15%, which is quite horrible. On the other hand, though, if you own a home, compared to the pre-pandemic, sorry, I feel like I shouldn't be moving. Compared to the pre-pandemic, your wealth is up $420,000 in Orange County. It's also up 272,000 in LA and roughly about 180,000 in Riverside and San Bernardino, right? So these are real numbers that kind of make people a bit more comfortable to go perhaps spend. And on the other side, if you look at home sales, now home sales completely cratered the moment the Fed start raising interest rates. So notice that this is Orange County home sales. They fell by almost 50% late in 2022, early 23, but they've kind of recovered a little bit. They're down now about 8%. Same story happens if you look at Los Angeles. So kind of you see that huge dip, and now they're kind of recovering a little bit. Riverside, San Bernardino is actually up 8%. Home sales are up 8%. We do think that some kind of recovery will continue to happen in the housing market, at least at the local level, when it comes to home sales. We do expect home sales to pick up a little bit. Now, of course, part of the reason why home sales have been completely restrained is because we have a huge housing supply issue, right? So in all Southern California. But here, let me see. But certainly we do see that a turnaround will happen in home sales. Now, when it comes to home prices, we don't see a correction. We do forecast that home prices will probably increase by now 3 to 5% this year for the local economy. So again, that's because housing supply is very restrained. And if the Fed starts cutting interest rates, there's going to be more demand. So that's going to put upward pressure on both sides of the market, on the housing market. And another sort of trouble corner of the market is also seems to be a little bit less problematic, seems to have turned around a little bit. So remember I mentioned the potential banking panic that could have set in last March, but it didn't. And that's because, of course, the Fed and the Treasury, went all out, and they were able to prevent almost a mini panic to become into a full-blown financial panic. Now, if you look at this at bank deposits, for example, notice that, it fell from basically, literally since the Fed has started raising interest rates, it fell by by $750 billion. But notice that at least the last 4 to 5 months, this seems to have stabilized. The hemorrhaging has stopped, right? So again, the banking crisis, and I'll talk a little bit more about this because we do think we're not quite out of the woods yet when it comes to the banks, but certainly that acute phase of the crisis seems to be over. At least it's not as concerning as it was before. So, now, of course, a lot of this money has now ended up in money market funds, right? So money market funds are up now about $1.1 trillion. So the big the deposit have been fleeing the banks, but put back into the money market. So all of this good news, right? All of this kind of paints a picture that this is not an economy that is about to fall into a recession, right? At least not right now. And certainly we're not forecasting one. Not right. In fact, we do think there's going to be no landing in the short term. We do think this is quite a resilient economy that will continue to kind of stay strong in the short term. But we are more concerned about the longer term, right? That, beyond the 10 months or beyond the 12 months. And kind of here, I feel like we're a little bit passengers of that Alaska flight. Remember that? A little earlier this year? I mean, the flight keeps flying. But remember the big size hole on the side of the plane? Now, there's many reasons for that big size hole on the side of the plane, but the number one reason is because the tightening by the Fed, we think, has not quite filtered entirely through the economy. There's still some slowdown that will come exactly from the tightening of interest rates. And in a sense, we can take some lessons from history in what happens when the Fed start raising interest. What happens when we have a rate hiking cycle? And in a sense, what are the rules of a recession? What happens before a recession? If back historically, this is going back to the 1950s. So there have been 10 recessions historically that we've seen, right? All of them have been preceded by interest rate hikes. Those bars are just basically how high the interest rate went right before the economy fell into a recession. And notice that, right now we have a 5.25 that I mentioned, but notice that with the exception of the 70s and the 80s when the inflation was out of hand and basically the Fed had to raise interest rates much higher, interest rates have been the most aggressive right now, right on this cycle, right? So that's, so again, that makes you worry a little bit about whether the effects of these interest rate hikes have actually been able to filter through the economy. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the hiking cycles have ended up in a recession. There have been 3 cases historically when the Fed raised interest rates, but the economy was able to kind of sidestep a recession. We didn't fall into the recession. I would call them sort of, these are the soft landing, those rare unicorns, those soft landing scenarios, right? So if you take, and there have been 3 cases of that, 1966, 84, and 94. And let's see what they all have in common. The first thing is that inflation in all of these 3 cases, and this is where you see peak inflation, was anywhere from 3% to 4.9%, right? Here's where we started right now. The peak inflation happened in June 2022. It was 9.1%. So remember back then, in those 3 cases, the Fed was kind of acting preemptively to basically tamper down sort of inflationary pressures from building up. Here is different. Here they're actually trying to lower inflation actively, right? So that's number one. The second thing is that the total rate hikes, basically, notice that how much was the tightening back then? Anywhere from 3% to 3.75%. Right now we're at 5.25%. So the tightening here has been more aggressive than in those 3 cases. So you see those differences between what's happening now and what happened in those 3 soft landing cases, which we're hoping, we'll be able to achieve. Now, the very third, so these are the first 2 factors. The third factor, which is important, is that soft landings, every time there have been a soft landing, the Fed when they increased interest rates in these 3 cases, the Fed acted very quickly and cut interest rates very aggressively. You can see this in 1966, so interest rates go up and they come down again. Same in 1984. Same in 1994, right? So you see that there is some decrease in interest rates. Now, so in a sense, you can think of it that soft landing are kind of recessions in the making, except for, except they end up being soft landing because the Fed has cut rates very aggressively. And here there's some hope. I mean, in the biggest sort of pivot that I can think of, last December, the Fed starts signaling that they're going to probably cut interest rates this year, right? The market has gone crazy based on that promise. So it is possible that we may avoid a recession. The Fed may be able to engineer a soft landing if they're able to cut rates without reigniting inflation, right? That's the concern here. Now, the Fed told us, and this could change everything, right? This could be, can I just remove this, I guess? Can you guys hear me without? Would I be able to be heard without it? Can you mute me? Because I think it's kind of distracting. Maybe it's bad. Can you guys hear me? Way better, yes. So this could actually change everything. Now, the Fed told us that they're going to lower interest rates probably by about 75 basis points. The market ran with it. They're going to think that they thought it was going to be 150 basis point cut, with the first one being expected in March. Just yesterday, as Jim mentioned, the Fed kind of poured some cold water into this hope that the March Fed cut will actually happen. Probably won't happen. We never thought that would be the case. Our own view is that we do think that the Fed will probably start cutting interest rates not until summer, and probably overall by 100 basis points. The market expects 150 basis points, right? So now, our own expectation seems to be a little bit similar to what the business leaders in Orange County seems to expect as well. We have our own survey where we ask 700 business leaders every quarter about their outlook for the economy and also various sort of important issues. And one of the questions we asked in the latest survey was, when do you think the Fed will cut interest rates? And here's their answer. About a quarter of them expect them to be cut in the first half of this year. But the vast, vast majority, 62% of Orange County business leaders do expect them to happen in the second half. And if there's there's also a minority, about 10% who think it's going to happen in 2025, and 4% think, there's not going to be any rate cuts over the next couple of years. So in a sense, people are expecting rate cuts, but probably unlike the market, to happen towards the second half of 2024. Now the question is, why are we a little bit more, less optimistic than the market when it comes to rate cuts? Why do we think that the Fed is not ready to pull the trigger so quickly and at least so aggressively?
Well, before I think that, before we hang like a mission accomplished banner for the Fed, before we start naming elementary schools after Jay Powell, I'd say let's take a look at inflation, right? Let's see what's happening with inflation, and let's see if they're going to be able to actually cut interest rates. On the other hand, I mean, if the economy is so strong, which it is, it kind of takes away the argument for the Fed raising interest rates. But just looking at inflation itself, of course, we made quite a bit of progress. CPI, as I mentioned, this is inflation has come down from 9.1% to 3.3%. But notice it kind of gets stuck here a little bit, right? You see that it's kind of stuck in the 3% range. Same story goes to the core inflation. It's come down from 6.6% to 3.9%. But both of them are still above the 2% target. We're going to get there, we're just not there yet, right? And it's not just that the fact that inflation has come down, but the overall price level has kind of stayed. I mean, it's price level is actually quite high, right? Even though inflation, we've seen disinflation, we haven't seen deflation. So in a sense, prices, if you go out there, they're still about 30% higher than what they were, 2 years ago. In fact, when I think about this price level overall, I'm always reminded of the Big Lebowski. Remember that half carton, half and half? You need half and half to make that White Russian, which I've consumed a lot of White Russians the last couple of years to drown the sorrows dealing with inflation, right? But if you look at that half carton of half and half gallon of half and half, which you need to make this drink, it was worth 69 cents in 1998 when the movie came out. Remember, the movie started with him writing a check for 69 cents at the grocery store. It's now worth $5.49. That's an 800% increase. To me, that's the real tragedy, right? That we can't even drown our sorrows of high inflation with a White Russian, right? But we do think that inflation will come down. I mean, I don't believe that we're going to have a second reignited sort of big wave, but it's going to take a little longer. Squeezing the last ounce of inflation will be a little harder. And there's a couple of reasons for it. The first thing is that the main disinflation we've seen lately has come primarily from kind of like one-off painless changes, I would call them. So for example, if you look at food inflation, which you see here, right? So of course, as supply chains kind of untangled from the pandemic, you see, food inflation come down from 11% to 2.7%. Historical average is a little lower, it's about 1.6%, but we're getting there, right? This is good news, but again, this had to do with supply chains, right? So once they kind of right-sized and went back to normal, you see that decrease in inflation. I do have a bit of good news here. Walmart told us recently that people are buying less food because they're binging on Ozempic. So maybe nobody cares about the food price. Maybe nobody would care about the food price in the future. Hopefully we solve this problem because of Ozempic at some point. But certainly this is a one-off change. And there's a bunch of these. If you look, for example, at energy prices. So here we have energy prices, huge increase, 40%. This is basically the Russia-Ukraine war. Huge decline. It's kind of come back up a little bit, but they're still in the negative territory, which has kind of brought down overall CPI prices. Same story if you look at used car prices. Huge increase over there, decline. This was, again, the supply chain disruptions with microchips and all the issues we had. Huge decline, a little bit of increase. In fact, if you think about this, the disinflation we've experienced over the last year or so is primarily due to goods prices. So if you look at goods prices in general, when supply chains scrambled during the pandemic, you had the huge increase. After they come back to normal, you see this huge decrease, and we're here, kind of in the negative value here. But pressures are building. Supply chain issues are coming back. If you look, for example, of course, partially because of huge geopolitical risks. Here we have ships through the Suez Canal. Usually there are about 530 ships on average that go there on a weekly basis. That has come down by 45%. Panama Canal is down another 40%, partially because they have a drought over there, these issues. So all of these are certainly going to kind of put more pressure on inflation, even on the good part of this inflation, the goods inflation that's come down, put a little bit more pressure, and we think we're going to have a little bit more difficulty getting a handle on inflation over the shorter term. But aside from this, right, they're kind of like another portion of inflation, what we call core inflation, is a little stickier in general. And there are two reasons for it. One is shelter or rent prices, and the other one are wages. So if you look at the shelter prices first, which you saw here, shelter inflation has come down from 8.1% to 6.2%, but this is still almost double, a little bit less than double the historical average. Again, we're going to come down, but it'll take a little bit. And of course, if you look at the biggest push here comes from rents. But if you look at rents that are the way they are represented in the CPI, again, they've come down from 8.8% to 6.5%. And the good news here is that rent prices, this is rents led by 12 months, so to see how much, to see where rents are going, the rents in the CPI, where this is happening. So notice that they increased by 60%, they're down to about historical average. Now, the bad news is this takes a little bit to filter into inflation statistics. So the disinflation we've seen in rents over the last few months is going to take a little bit. It usually takes about 12 months. So we do think we're going to get there basically with CPI shelter kind of coming down to the historical average, but not until probably late this year, early next year. So a little bit more work here to do. And the second reason are wages. Now wages have been normalizing, certainly. I mean, we see a huge increase in wages that's actually normalized quite a bit. But again, this will take a little bit more time, right? So the labor market is still a little tight. I know it's right sizing, it's going back to normal, but it's still a little tight. If you look at job openings, we've come down from 12 million to 9 million right now. In fact, the latest number, which was issued on Tuesday, was a little bit of uptick. So people are still looking to fill positions, but the number of unemployed are still 6.3 million. So that's about 2.7 million shortage that it's still out there, which will probably put some pressure on wages, right, going forward. And some jobs, as we know, have been very, very difficult to fill. We had a really hard time about 5 months ago filling a position. Now, remember that story? Remember the drama? Must be itself. So it's a tough job. Now, we do have someone, right? But these jobs seems to be still a little precarious. So I have a solution for Congress if we end up with no speaker again. Like I said, she's everywhere. She's felt like I'm haunted by her everywhere, right? So again, labor demand is still high. On the other side, there isn't much help from labor supply. So if you look, for example, at labor force participation rates, because that's what we look for. How many people are available to get these jobs, right? Now, if you look at the very young, huge drop during the pandemic. Participation rates are almost back to normal there. Same story for the prime age, 25 to 54 years old. The 55 to 64-year-old, they retired and then they unretired. So look at that. There's a huge participation rate. They've gone back up. Now there's only one group, those that are over 65, for which the labor force participation rate is kind of below where it was compared to the pandemic. But I have to say, not everybody in this group is a slacker. There's a bunch of people that are pulling up in this age group, the participation rate, right? They'll never leave. They're the future, right? So they're still at work. Trump is practically a baby compared to the rest of them at 77. I have to say, those are the age, right, how old they are. So certainly, but the problem is that the labor supply side, which seems to be a little constrained, plus the fact that demand for labor is still high, will probably keep wages a little higher for a little longer. Again, wages will normalize, which will filter into inflation statistics, but it will take just a little bit longer. Now, of course, so all of this makes us a little worried about the long run. And as I mentioned, so a still too high inflation plus a pretty strong economy in the short run makes us think the Fed is not ready to basically pivot for real, to cut interest rates earlier rather than later, right? And in fact, unlike those three special scenarios, those three soft landing cases, remember, three things are different this time. We started with higher inflation, the Fed has tightened more, and they're probably not going to cut as aggressively given these dynamics, that inflation is still there, plus strong economy. They're not going to cut as quickly as what may be needed to engineer a soft landing. So maybe we may experience a mini recession, like I said, in the longer term, beyond the 10-month horizon. Now, of course, one can even make the argument that this is the time when interest rates are kind of starting to bite. They're not quite filtered through the economy yet. So here, for example, you have the real federal funds rate. This is sort of like, federal funds rate minus inflation. Notice that it has been positive for a few months, but this is when things start to bite. This is when the real pain is felt, when real interest rates are actually starting positive. We worry that, the economy eventually, ultimately, may not stay sort of like this higher interest rates. And remember, real interest rates may be higher for longer because as inflation declines, they're going to go even higher, right? So that's the concern. Now, of course, the other thing that we worry about is that some parts of the economy are some corners of the economy, not the core yet, because like I said, for the core, we think we have strong growth for the short term. But some parts of the economy seem to be slowing a little bit. So for example, if you look at money supply here, of course, money supply has been declining because the Fed has been raising interest, has been kind of raising interest rates and reducing the money supply, but it rose by 26% during the pandemic. It's now negative. This is the first negative number we see outside the two world wars. So that again, this will have contractionary effect in the economy. If you look at industrial production, another decline there, right? So manufacturing has actually been in a recession last year. We've had some kind of this rolling recession that has engulfed some sectors. Manufacturing is one of them. And in a sense, cracks are kind of beginning to appear on consumer balance sheets. If, for example, if you look at credit card delinquencies, notice that they're up. And so as the auto delinquencies, they're actually as high as they were in 2011 when we were exiting the Great Recession. Same goes for auto delinquencies, right? So you see this, a little bit of cracks kind of appearing, some strains on consumers' balance sheets. Corporate bankruptcies. We had 595 corporate bankruptcies last year. That's the highest number since 2011. Again, this was as we exited the Great Recession. And of course, the labor market has been great, spectacular, right? The best we've seen in decades. But there are some warning signs. They're not very obvious yet, but there are a couple of warning signs here as well. For example, if you look at part-time employment, now these gray bars, and you're going to see them again and again, these are recession bars, right? Notice that part-time employment has kind of gone, these are people that are involuntary part-time. They're looking for full-time jobs, but they can't get full-time jobs. They're only getting part-time jobs, right? But notice that it's gone up a little bit. And notice what happens right before each recession. Part-time employment kind of tends to go up because that's what happens for you don't fire people, you may move them part-time and so on, right? So a little bit of strain there. We're not saying we're going to have a recession. Hopefully we'll dodge one. But again, things are going to cool off and going forward, again, in about 12 months or so, 10 months or so. Another warning sign is temporary employment. If you look at temporary help here, and again, the gray bars are recession bars. Notice that this kind of temp help has come down. Notice what happens before each recession. It kind of turns a little bit. These two indicators are leading indicators. Again, the labor market is a lagging indicator, but these kind of give us a sense on the strains of the labor market. Another strain in the labor market is job breadth, right? The new jobs that are created, where are they coming from? Now, in 2022, about 11% of jobs came from government and healthcare. And about almost 90% from the rest of the private sector, right? That's a healthy growth. But the first 3 quarters of last year, notice that slowly, that government and healthcare has kind of been increasing, and the share coming from the other sectors has been decreasing. In fact, the last quarter, almost 2/3 of job growth came from government and healthcare. Much smaller from the other sectors. Again, it's another warning sign to us, at least, that as the job breadth kind of narrows, we may be heading into some trouble, again, down the line, not right now, that's sort of down the line. The other worry that we have, and I mentioned this earlier, is that, yes, a banking sector panic has completely been avoided, it's true. We don't have a full-blown crisis, we won't have one, we don't expect to have one, but banks are not kind of out of the woods yet. And that's because, for example, the biggest concern for us is for regional and small banks. They have huge exposure to commercial real estate loans. They write about 70% of commercial real estate loans. And really small banks, those with less than $10 billion in assets, they have huge exposure. 20% to 25% of the total assets are in commercial real estate. Problem is commercial real estate has had a horrible year. In fact, it will continue to have a tough time going forward. If you look here at multifamily sector, valuations are down 15%. Office is down 8.3%, but we are very doubtful that number is correct. And that's because very few transactions are happening, so the real pain is not really being shown in the market. We hear anecdotal evidence that, the office market in New York and San Francisco is down 50%, right? So that's not so probably the real pain is much higher in the office market. Retail, industrial still down quite a bit. In fact, another problem is that a lot of these commercial real estate debt is coming due. About $730 billion was supposed to be refinanced last year. About a quarter was actually in office. Remember, these are being refinanced at higher interest rates. In fact, going forward, we have $660 billion next year, another almost $600 billion in 25. So $1.2 trillion needs to be refinanced over the next couple of years or so. And this is happening at precisely the wrong time, right? This is the time when banks are tightening credit in these loans, and when valuations are down, which means that it makes us think of some of these assets in these small banks' balance sheets are probably going to go a little sour, right? Given these kind of dynamics in the commercial real estate market. And in fact, again, we don't think we're going to fall into, this is not financial crisis. This is not going to push us into a recession, for the very simple reason that commercial real estate is kind of small. If you think about it, commercial real estate is worth $5 trillion in terms of the overall debt market. Mortgage worth $15 trillion, right? So it's a third of the mortgage market. It's not big enough to kind of push us into a recession, but we do think it's going to make banks very hesitant to lend. So if you look at it here, this is total loan growth for 2022 from January to December. Very healthy growth rate 2 years ago, about 12%. Look at it last year. Banks have already been holding back, not lending. These are for commercial loans, right? And that's because there's a lot of uncertainty out there, especially for commercial real estate loans. And here's another leading indicator. And again, those gray bars are recession bars. But notice that this is banks tightening standards. So tighter credit is down here, easier credit is up there. Notice that every time it's gotten harder to get credit, there's been a recession. You see those bars. This is pretty tight right now. We haven't seen a recession, and again, hopefully we'll avoid one. But certainly this is pointing towards less loan growth. And you can see that this will drag down the commercial loans into negative territory. And that's precisely sort of how again, not a financial crisis, but how a credit squeeze is made up, right? So this is sort of like, we don't see a financial panic arising from this, but more of a slow-moving, corrosive, kind of low-grade credit squeeze that will probably squeeze the credit from the market. And there's actually a couple of other leading indicators that are, again, always pointing to some risks ahead, again, down the line. If you look, for example, at conference board leading indicator, this actually has been correct 100% of the time. This leading indicator has actually correctly predicted a recession 100% of the time since World War II. And again, those gray bars are recession bars. We've always had a recession as long as the leading index has been below 4%. We're almost at 7% right now, so that's already flashing some warning signs. Here's another warning sign. The lead yield curve has been inverted for about 15 months, right? And again, those gray bars are recession bars. We're in deep negative territory. It's kind of uninverting a little bit now, but that's what happened in the last two recessions. The curve started to uninvert, and then we had a recession. But notice that he has correctly predicted almost all of the recessions of the post-war era. He gave one false signal, and that was in 1966. That was that soft landing that I mentioned earlier. But in general, it's been a pretty good leading indicator. We do have a better leading indicator, we think, that you're going to appreciate this. Taylor Swift dating life, right? In 2008, she was dating. We were in a recession. In 2019, she was dating. In 2020, we had the pandemic. We had a recession. And of course, she's everywhere now, ruining NFL for the rest of us. So that is a flashing sign, right? That kind of gets us a little worried about where the economy is headed. I think this is sort of more foolproof than anything I've shown you today. All those Great Recession bars. No. This is something to keep an eye on. Now, how long do we think we have until the downshift or the mini recession, if there is to have one? I mean, I kind of mentioned again and again, the short run, we don't think we're going to have one. The economy is pretty strong. But the answer could be found also in what's going to happen in two things. What's going to happen with fiscal deficit, because if we print money and keep spending, we can always avoid a recession. And what's going to happen to excess savings. So again, government spending, the highest we've ever seen outside of a recession. This was last year. Sounds like the deficit is going to be another $1.8 trillion this year. So potentially they could keep us afloat for a little bit. Warren Buffett, I think, said, I buy expensive suits, they look cheap on me. But, we kind of bought very expensive kind of growth with this kind of fiscal deficit. But obviously it's coming back, we're going to pay on it because we're going to have higher interest rates in the future. And of course, I mentioned the second reason why this is going to be sort of we have some staying power, the economy has some staying power, is because of excess savings. Again, we have about $1 trillion out there. This is mostly in the coffers of the higher income of the distribution, not the bottom of the distribution. Bottom of the distribution is actually done spending their excess income, but there's still, in aggregate, some money out there. So again, these two would probably hold us for a little while. Like I said, maybe in the next 10 months or so, 12 months. I have another, perhaps better indicator for you, Britney Spears. So here's an even better indicator. Now in February 2007, she shaved her head. I don't know if you remember this, but in December of that year, we actually fell into recession. So about 11 months maybe between when she does something bizarre and something bad happens to the economy, right? Right now, she's actually kind of playing, I don't know if you've seen this, but in TikTok, she has some videos of playing with knives. So I give it maybe another 10, 11 months or so. Maybe, right? So where does this leave us? So we do think we have a strong growth now, continued resilience economy right now, a downshift later. So again, pretty strong growth first half of the year, a little bit of a wobble towards the end of this year, early next. That's for real GDP growth. Overall growth, again, decent this year, slower next year. Employment growth, again, we don't see any job losses probably until early in 25. If there is any, that little mini recession or slowdown, if you will. Unemployment rate edging up a little bit. CPI kind of coming down to the normal level slowly. So where does this leave us, right? So just to kind of wrap things up, and I usually try to leave on a wish in general. So I actually did something different this time. I asked ChatGPT to write me a poem about recession, but in the words of the Big Lebowski. So here, it actually did pretty good, I guess. And here's what it came up with. It said, markets are down, it's a real bummer. The dude abides, he won't lose his summer. So let's take it easy and ride the tide, because in the end, it's just a crazy ride. I thought it was pretty damn good. But we will replace all of us, right? So I would say grab your bowling shoes, if you remember from the movie, and that White Russian, because it's very important, and let's abide and ride the tide. And with that, thank you. Any questions? I'll be open to any questions, anything. Yes, Norm. Don't ask me about the election, please.
Has there been any survey of graduates moving into the market in different industries, for instance, in AI or into different areas of technology? Or is graduates, are they diminishing? College attendance going down?
Yeah, well, both, so we see some college attendance going down, at least, but those are more demographic, at least for in Southern California, but those are mostly reflecting demographic shifts. Now, I think it's almost like a two-part question. We do see an increase in AI jobs, and especially in Orange County. California in general, but Orange County is doing pretty well on high-tech type jobs, AI jobs, and so on. I'm not sure that those are necessarily recent graduates. I gotta think that probably some of them must be, because we don't have that breakdown. But we do have certainly an increase in startup in two things: employment in the high-tech area and a startup in the AI and high-tech area, at least for the state of California, but specifically even in Orange County, which is kind of heartening, I think. So that's sort of like, that we see in the data. I'm not sure whether they're just, you know, the people who are doing that, they're just people who just finished school and they're just graduated, or they're, you know, they've been out for a little while, but we do see those two trends kind of picking up steam. As one would imagine they would, especially given the AI sort of boost that we've seen last year, right? So I'm not surprised that we see it, and I expected to see even more going forward. But we do see that in the data. More questions? Yes?
Just how big is the U.S. Treasury, and how much debt are we carrying versus that amount of money that we have as a nation?
Yeah, not there's a pot of gold sitting somewhere. I mean, you know, that Fort Knox have sailed a long time ago. So no, I mean, the debt obviously, as you well know, it's about $33 trillion, which is about 106% of GDP, so it's bigger than what we produce in 1 year. And we keep adding, if we keep adding 1.8 trillion to $2 trillion when we don't have a recession, because that's the concern, right? I mean, it's reasonable to assume that you spend a lot more money during a recession because you have all this automatic sort of programs kicking in, like unemployment insurance, but you don't have that when the economy is doing so well. The concern is, of course, is that as that continues to pile up, we're going to pay more debt. Some of the numbers that we've cranked on our end, I mean, it's already the debt, the interest we pay on the debt is about $800 billion right now, which is pretty much as we pay on defense. But if you look forward with if things go as they are right now, with the projections that we have, by 2027, we're going to pay about $1.5 trillion in just the interest on that debt, right? So that's not sustainable, obviously, in the long run, because it's going to stifle everything else. And you got to prioritize, and you got to pay interest payment on the debt first. That's not sustainable. Now, there's things we can do. Obviously, nothing is getting done. But anybody, and I don't care what kind of political affiliation you have, everybody agrees that this is not sustainable. This debt is not sustainable. The puzzling thing to me has been that we've spent so much money, and again, that's why we were all wrong. Why we spend so much money when the economy is doing so well? There was no reason to spend near $2 trillion in, you know, $1.4 trillion sounded the right sized fiscal deficit given the Social Security and the commitment we have to those programs. 1.4 trillion sounded like a right size sort of debt to have, fiscal deficit to have for last year. We didn't. We ended up with $600 billion more, which, as I said, probably made the difference between a recession, a mild recession if there were going to be one. It is possible we could have avoided a recession anyway, even if it was not the $600 billion. But to me, it's been puzzling why we're putting in so much money when the economy is actually doing quite decent, because we already had a $6 trillion before that is still residing in people's bank account, right, in these excess savings that we're talking about. Now, I never got any excess savings. I always feel I'm broke, but, you know, everybody else seems to have this excess savings, and I keep talking about it. So it's not me, certainly. But there's got to be some, I mean, seems to be more money out there that will probably carry us for the short time. That's why I'm actually, so in a sense, I characterize our outlook for the economy as more optimistic than the consensus in the short run, because a lot of consensus are expecting a soft landing, but they're expecting to slow down very quickly. I don't see us slowing down, at least over the, 6, 7, 8 months. I mean, there's a lot of positive in the economy to carry us for that long. But we're more pessimistic than them longer term. So if you can make that distinction, so that more clear. Thank you. More questions? Yes.
So you mentioned the Magnificent Seven,
Yes.
as a major portion of the stock market growth that feels bubblish. Bubbles bursting have gotten us in trouble in the last 20 to 30 years. What do you think are the top 2 or 3 bubble concerns right now? You can say the Magnificent Seven again, you already did, but if so, I want 2 more.
Yeah, so you see a lot of analysis out there that kind of, and Jim could answer this better than me, he's the expert here. But they sort of equate this to the bubble of 2000, the tech bubble of 2000 that burst ultimately. There is a difference. I mean, the growth that is happening in this company. So I don't see it as bubble-ish, if you will, as what it was in 2000. In 2000, you have young kids that are in their garage creating a .com, right? This is happening in big companies. There's a reason for it. It's the AI revolution. There's certainly a reason behind it, and the companies that are benefiting from it are those that are investing so much in AI, which I think is going to be a game changer, not 20 years down the line, but 4 or 5 years down the line, right? So it is a bit less bubblish to me than what you have seen in the previous bubbles, you know, like I said, the tech bubble of 2000. So I'm a bit less concerned about that. Now there is, it feels, some euphoria is there, some you know, you can see a little bit sort of baked in the price. If you ask me, are they overvalued? I'd say yes. But even if there is to be a correction on the Max 7, it'll probably be not to the level that we saw in 2000. Again, because I think it is baked into the fundamentals, and because of the AI revolution, again, it doesn't seem as bubblish to me as it would have been, as it was 23 years ago during the tech bubble. So, any more questions? I hope I didn't depress everybody. I thought I had good news.
I think it's
good thing. I mean, next 10 buzz are good for me. You know,
It's reasonably optimistic.
You're reasonably optimistic for the shorter term.
Yes. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
I do have like 4 takeaways from that presentation. You'll appreciate this, Mira. New market barometers. It's going to be Taylor Swift, Ozempic, movie ticket sales, and Britney Spears. So I'm going to keep an eye on those. So thank you all for being here and braving the weather. Looks like we got a respite here so you can get home safely. I've got to thank Sue, my sister in the back. She made this event happen. And my daughter was there. She was help checking people in. Caitlin, is she hiding back there? She's very shy, so I don't want to. So, well, thank you. It's great seeing everybody. And again, have a safe journey home. Thank you for coming.